In today's episode, we examine how the rom-com genre has been flipped on its head to expand, and I am here for it. Howdy. I'm Jeff Goldsmith. I'm the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, I am absolutely here for it. Today's movie is Bros. It opens in theaters nationwide. You cannot see it anywhere else. I highly recommend you mask up and go support this film. It is the first mainstream studio-backed gay rom-com, and I really hope audiences go to it so we could see more movies like this. I'm quite pleased to have with us today the co-writer and director of this fine film, good old Nicholas Stoller. Of course, he co-wrote Bros with the film star, Billy Eichner. And without a doubt, as you'll hear us talk about, it's a personal film for Billy, although it is still a work of fiction for sure. And Nick and Billy did a great job of examining just what a rom-com can be in 2022. And the results are both funny and also very compelling. It's always a blast to have Nick in the podcast, and today is no exception. He was very forthcoming about what it took to co-write and direct this film, so I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, Backstory Magazine turns 10. That's right, we survived a decade, and we couldn't have done it without your help. And the other good news is that we just released a new issue. Yes, issue 47, our summer issue, is live, and there is so much great stuff in it. I hope you check out the table contents to see it all, but we have Emmy Awards contenders ranging from Stranger Things, Better Call Saul, Station 11, Barry, Hacks, and What We Do in the Shadows, to summer movies, to new scripts for you to read, to an interview with director John Carpenter on the 40th anniversary of The Thing. Man, there are so many great things in this issue, and I hope you check it out. If you have never read us before, you can, of course, test drive us over at backstory.net and read the free issue, or you could use the iPad app Backstory, where you could read the free issue there as well. And if you like what you see, and I hope you do, you could consider becoming a subscriber. And to sweeten the deal, I want to give you discount coupon code SAVE5. That will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. The code will work at backstory.net, and you enter it there in your checkout cart, but it'll give you access to both backstory.net and the iPad app as well. So, it's 2 for 1. You get access to both easily. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube channel, which is all the Zoomcast go of these interviews. So you could see us do the interviews. You don't have to just hear us, but it would really mean a lot to me to have you subscribe to my passion project. So thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with co-writer and director Nicholas Stoller about his latest film, Bros. It's been a hot minute. How's it going, man? It's good to see you.
Good. How are you? Nice to see you.
Howdy. I love some of these Zoomcasts. I'm just going to out you on this for a second for our listeners. Nick needed to prop up his camera. He grabbed a book. Why don't you tell the folks what book you grabbed and how many times you've read it?
I grabbed The Hero's Journey, and I have read it 0 times.
But now it's touching your phone.
It's touching my phone.
It touched your hand.
I feel like it's indicative of the choices I've made in my career that I refuse to read that book, even though I own it.
Even though you own it. So
yeah,
maybe you'll thumb through it.
Maybe I'll look through it. Maybe it'll change how I approach stuff.
Yeah, I see big change in your future.
I've rejected the call of reading the book. Sorry, that's a call of reading the book for fans of Joseph Campbell.
Yes,
but now maybe it's a second chance.
Well, you need to go to a new realm to read it. You must.
Like a quiet room in my house.
Yeah, you must leave your familiar realm in which you are comfortable, and you must get out of your comfort zone to read Hero of a Thousand Faces.
Yes.
Well, look, it's a strange time in the film industry. So I've interviewed you multiple times for different things in the past. So we've covered a lot of your breaking in story. I guess I'll throw this curveball at you as things are just so fluid and changing in the film industry right now. What advice do you have for young folks looking to break in? Because it seemed like for a while that streamers were very rock solid, almost brick and mortars of sorts, like a good place to go. And now they're in a little upheaval because of the economy and different stock prices. The film industry itself, people can't decide, are people coming to theaters? Are they still staying at home? Things are all over the place. But What advice, if any, would you give to a writer that's just coming into it right now?
I'd approach it the same way I approached it when I was entering. I think that the big difference is there's social media now, and there's all these video apps, and there's all this, TikTok. And so I think there's a whole world of stuff that you can make video and make content to get attention. And that's probably more useful if you're trying to act. As a writer, I'll just say my wife and I have a show called Platonic. We just hired people for that. We read people's samples. So it wasn't like we were looking at their videos or anything like that. I think using those platforms like Twitter or TikTok or whatever can get you attention. So I could imagine that being useful as a form of self-promotion, but you're still going to need to be able to write a script, whether that be a TV script if you're applying for a TV show, or a movie script if you want to break into movies. So it's kind of the same thing. And I think, the economy's all over the place, streamers are all over the place, but there's always some sort of distribution of entertainment, and it just kind of shifts around. And what's funny is it's often the same people who are running them. They just like move from job to job. So when one goes bankrupt, they're at a new one, So it kind of is the same thing. It's not the same thing in that there's so much content, that there's so many voices being broadcast, which is awesome and really exciting. But it also is the same in that there's still distribution, still people want to watch stuff at home.
Well, yeah, it's funny. Like I've heard some showrunners sometimes are open to out of the box stuff that's a little off left. So did anybody submit a play, like a stage play as a writing sample rather than a screenplay?
The big difference is that when I was starting out, you would write spec scripts based on existing shows. And that doesn't really happen as much anymore. People don't do that. Most people write pilot specs. So they'll write a pilot generally based on their lives or on a funny idea or whatever. And so that's generally what you're submitted. It gets you a better sense of their tone and whatnot. I've never been submitted like, look at this TikTok video and then hired someone off of that. I think that stuff does help you get agents and does help you get your foot in the door. Like I did notice like when various agents were sending us submissions that they would say, this person has 50,000 followers on Twitter and this person has had 1 million views on this. And so it certainly helps for me. And I'm speaking for one showrunner or director or whatever. I wouldn't hire purely off of that because that's not what you're doing when you're in a writer's room. You're figuring out story, you're figuring out characters. It's purely based on the sample.
That makes sense.
I also say one other thing, is that there are so few good samples. Like there are very few. So if you have to keep writing, you have to keep working at it. But if you write a good one, it will find its way. I do believe that. My instinct is always that acting is a real crapshoot. There are a lot of good actors. That seems very scary to me. But it's hard to find a good writer. It's real hard.
And producers are desperately looking for good content. So, actually going back to what you said a second ago, I am a little surprised. It makes sense that people are submitting pilots, right? Because it shows world building, it shows creation of character. But at the same time, specs, the purpose of people submitting a spec of one of their favorite shows to be considered for a staff writer position was also to prove that they could inhabit someone else's universe and they could write that Simpsons episode just in the similar tone of those actual writers, or Breaking Bad or whatever. The one rule is never submit the spec of the show to the show you're writing the spec for. But so I am slightly interested to hear that people aren't doing that as often, but I guess pilots make sense.
They're not. Yeah. The other thing is I've gotten writers through Shouts and Murmurs, which is its own, gauntlet to get through. And then I'll also say the meeting is really important. So if you get a meeting with a showrunner, the number of times like I've met with someone, I've loved their spec, and then I meet with them. They haven't watched anything I've made, or weirdly, they'll just insult stuff I've made. And it's not like I'm so perfect. I have plenty of criticisms about stuff I've made, but you don't want to do that. And when they talk too much, because in a writer's room, everyone needs an equal amount of time in the writer's room. Yeah. And a big red flag for me is someone who talks too much in the meeting and is trying to dominate the meeting in some way, or just has that weird thing where they can't tell that they're talking too much. Right. That's like a big no-no. It can be the funniest script ever. And I've literally been like, that person talks too much. They'll screw up the dynamic of the room. And
You're just giving a million writers nightmares right now. It's true.
The meeting is important. Just be cool.
Wait, just be normal. What's the biggest insult that a writer has lobbed at your work in a meeting with you?
The biggest insult is just, I remember on season 2 of Friends from College, I think we met with someone who hadn't watched the show. I was like, why are you meeting us? Like, just watch the show. You have to watch the show before you meet on the show. So it's that.
That's funny.
I feel like I've had writers say like, oh, I didn't like that or whatever. Again, that's fine. It's totally fine to not like something I've
Sure.
made. And I'll have those conversations with people. I'm always trying to learn. Not if I'm hiring you. If I'm hiring you, it's because you like my stuff and you want to be involved in it.
Right.
So that's not helpful. I think it doesn't hurt my feelings. I actually find it hilarious, but it makes me think we're probably tonally not going to be on the same page.
Yeah, that is really random, man. That's really random. Well, so okay, this is like a dream writing assignment in a way, because this is one of those things that Hollywood for years has kind of said is impossible, to do a mainstream gay rom-com. And no one's really cracked that code. People have tried for sure. And I got to say, kudos to you and Billy for doing it, because bros really did crack the code. And
oh my God, thank you so much.
I want to talk about the development of it. Tell me when you first got involved with the project. I know Judd Apatow is also a producer, so it probably stemmed somewhere over there. Tell us what it was like in its infancy.
I started it. It started with me.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I had worked. So I cast Billy in Neighbors 2. I knew him from Billy on the Street. I obviously knew he was a comic genius. He was really funny. And then I cast him in the show that I created with my wife called Friends from College. Before this, I'll say I love rom-coms. I had made 2 at the time. Now I've made 3. I'd always wondered why there wasn't a big studio romantic comedy about 2 men falling in love. But I was like, I can't do that myself. I'm straight. It's not my story to tell. I would do a bad job if I tried to do it. And so, but I was curious. I was like, that would be a great thing to put out there. And just because it would be funny, it's a fresh story that has been told in a hard R studio kind of way. And so I cast Billy in Neighbors 2. Then I cast him in the show Friends from College that my wife and I created. And then he was a really good actor. I did not know that. He was excellent when I directed him. He had some dramatic scenes. He was really good in it. And then we showed the first episode of Friends from College in a movie theater. And every time he was on screen, the audience exploded in laughter. And it was one of those things where I was like, oh, he's like a movie star. It reminded me of when Jonah Hill, this is going back a ways, was in 40-Year-Old Virgin in the eBay store. And the whole audience was like in stitches. And it was very clear this guy had some amazing magical thing. And it was the same thing with Billy. And I was like, he's a movie star. He deserves a comedy vehicle built around him. Also, like me, he's a tall Jew. So I emailed him and I was like, hey, would you want to build a comedy vehicle for you? I think romantic comedy around you and around your whole comic persona would be really interesting and funny and good, and you deserve it. And he was like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Let's get into it. And so we started working on it then. And that was 5 years ago. We started working on it. So a long time ago. And then we worked on the story for a while. He, early on, I was like, do you want to bring Judd into this? He was into the idea, And so after 6 months, maybe of figuring out the story, Judd was my mentor and now a good friend of mine. I called Judd. He was into the idea. We pitched it to him. He loved it. We brought it to Universal, where I've directed all my live action movies. And Universal immediately was like, let's do it. We were kind of all systems go. And then the pandemic happened. I was scouting Buffalo, New York in March of 2020. And when I literally had to shut the movie down, which is really weird for a director to have to do. It goes against every instinct.
We're going to get there. And I want to get to there. But before we do, we got to talk about the script more. So when you and Billy sat down, at what point did you realize you were going to write it together? I mean, obviously you wanted to tell his story, but to my knowledge, Billy, he doesn't have any produced screenplays per se, and maybe he has some unproduced, but was this his first screenwriting experience? Yeah, it was. And he, I said to him in the email, I was like, we could, I'd like to write it with you and I would direct and you would star. He wanted to do that. It's obviously much more his life experience than mine. I mean, there's a little bit of me in there, but it's his, his experiences, but he'd never written a movie. He'd never tried to, I don't think he'd even tried to write a movie or none that he'd mentioned to me. And I've now talked to him so many times. I feel like he would have. And so he was like, he wanted to do it because he didn't know how to do it, and it is a specific thing. And a studio comedy is a specific thing. So it's one thing to try to write an indie movie or, whatever, but a studio comedy that has to deliver a certain kind of experience is also a specific thing. Well, and breaking a genre down and flipping it on its head in a way that it hasn't been delivered before is also really fascinating. So all of that. You just mentioned that Apatow is a mentor of yours. Here you are essentially mentoring Billy for storytelling, for screenwriting. And from a lot of writers that I've talked to in the past, that could be a really reinvigorating experience because you're seeing somebody have really fresh eyes and take different approaches rather than adhere to every single rule that you've adhered to in your writing career. What were some of the things that you noticed about Billy's habit and approach to screenwriting that kind of made you be like, oh yeah, let's go that way? Yeah, I learned so much from him. And it's one of the great privileges of this career. It's very collaborative and I'm always learning from the people I'm working with. Just now, this show that
There's a second show I've done with my wife called Platonic. It stars Rose Byrne and Seth Rogen. I've worked with both of them a few times now. I've learned from them every time I work from them. There's, I'm always learning from different people. And so it's the same thing with Billy. I learned a ton from him. I think one of the things is he and I write very differently. So, and this is true. I write a lot of crappy drafts very quickly. So I just write draft after draft after draft after draft. That's just like how I do it. I don't know why. This is how I've done it forever. He writes a kind of perfect draft very slowly. And I think that combination, and I've had that before. I worked with this excellent writer, I'm sure you've talked to, Rodney Rothman. He was a producer on my first 3 movies, and he's a similar. He writes a perfect draft, like on the slower side of things. He can be fast, but like he just writes, and I'm just shitty draft, and slowly it gets better. Like it's a slow, And so I think that combination first is a great combination. Both things, we're both bringing different things to the table. Secondly, I think I do like long talky scenes. It's something I've gotten more and more into. I always liked them, but I've gotten more into them. I think, I was an EP on the Carmichael show, and that was a big thing that we wanted to do on that show, is have like almost the one scene be a whole episode. But Billy really wanted to do that. And he also wanted to do monologues, which I hadn't really done before, and is not really in movies that often, or TV for that often, that often. And he kept promising me, he was like, I talk fast, it will be fine. And I was like, I trust you. I mean, let's do it. And I'll see if there's ways that I can cut into it if I have to, but let's do it. And then thirdly, and this was when we got to the editing portion, that beach monologue that, I don't want to ruin it.
We'll get to it.
We'll get to that. There's stuff in the movie that's purely dramatic. And usually, I mean, all my movies are dramas, essentially. Any good comedy is a drama. But I always am trying to undercut the drama with comedy just to keep it in tone. And on this movie, there's a few moments where I don't. And it made me nervous. I was worried the movie could shift into melodrama, or the audience might reject it just because it wasn't in the right tone. So it wouldn't feel honest to the story. It's not like I need a joke, but just because it wouldn't feel honest. And we didn't, and it worked. It worked great. All of that was great. And I learned a lot. I'll bring all those lessons to the next stuff I'm writing and working on,
Well, I want to talk pragmatically for a second. I mean, what you were talking about, writing really fast, draft after draft, that's, the concept of doing a vomit pass, just getting something out there, not over debating it. You can't sculpt unless you have clay. Your vomit pass is your clay that you could then start revising, because you at least have something to revise. And you said Billy likes to go slower. I'm curious, were you guys writing different parts of the same draft at the same time? Or were you writing your own drafts that you were then combining when you talk about the two of you writing at different paces?
So he and I would meet, and we just, it's kind of the same. It was the same when I write with Jason Segel or with Seth or whatever. Like, we sit and we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk. We talk about the story, and we talk about emotional stuff, and we talk about our own lives. He talks about his life. I talk about my life. We talk about, so we're just talking and talking and talking. And then we slowly talk about the story. I'll be taking notes, or an associate producer on the movie, Ciara, might be taking notes. And we really figure out this outline that's very long. And then once we have that, we kind of work off of that. And we sometimes we split up scenes. He would often do, more than any actor I've worked with, he really felt ownership over the material and would often do the last pass of the scenes. I certainly, I wrote a version of probably of every scene in the movie at some point. Or a lot of them.
It's good you started talking about outlining, because, I always ask that about your habit. So when you guys outlined together, you finally, I'm guessing after a series of long conversations, finally had the structure, the bones of the film. Did you do it with note cards? Did you use like a long document? What was your outlining process like?
We started with a Microsoft Word long document, and then eventually, and I hate cards, but they're so useful. They're such a pain in the butt, but you kind of always need a card. Eventually, once we had a few drafts, we'd outline what's in the draft, and then we would put it up on cards. And what's interesting with cards are visual, and I swear it sparks some visual part of your brain where you can like look at the cards and like see the scenes, and suddenly you're like seeing the scenes, and you can move scenes around, and you suddenly see it, and you're like, oh, those 3 scenes we don't need, and your scenes fall off the board, and it becomes, and it sucks. Cards are so annoying because you have to write out all these cards, but carding is very useful. I've never been disappointed doing cards.
Well, some people have very specific carding habits, like, this many cards equals an act. Do you do it like that, or do you just kind of go with the flow?
I go with the flow a little bit more. I'll say one of the best writing lessons I got was from, I had years ago, I asked Nora Ephron to have a drink.
Wow.
And she did. I don't know if I've told you this story.
No.
And it was amazing. It was before a 5-year engagement, and I just wanted to ask her how she does what she does, and she's obviously like a god, and like
the queen of rom-coms herself.
Yeah, the queen of rom-coms, one of the one of the greatest filmmakers ever, I think, and writers ever. And so she said that she learned something from Mike Nichols, which is two things. One which is very useful and I use all the time, particularly at the beginning of writing a story, which is you break your movie into 8 chapters, 2 chapters for the first act, 4 for the second, and 2 for the third. And that in each chapter, the entire movie, the entire story has to change. So you cannot tell the same story beat. And it's really useful because you'll find when you're writing a script, you'll be like, why am I bored? Or why can't I think of anything? And when you look at the chapters, you're like, oh, there's not new story here. I need a new story beat here, And so that is super helpful, particularly for first drafts, because it's also easier to break up a script into 8 pieces than it is into 3 pieces. It's like literally just psychologically easier. The second thing she told me that Mike Nichols told her, which I've used sometimes and not other times, but I always try to do it because it really helps in terms of writing, is start your movie with a visual metaphor. So the example in a Mike Nichols movie that she told me was Working Girl, which starts with a shot of the Statue of Liberty. And it's a woman going to New York. That's like what it is, a woman going to the city. And what it does is it forces you to think about what's my movie about, And I actually bailed on it, but it did force me on 5-year engagement to think like, what's the first image? And it was going to be them driving through fog. I kind of wish I'd done it and not being able to see where they're going, because that was like the whole point of that movie was, I should have done it. That would have been cool. But I would do that now. I don't think I had as much confidence then. And fog was also visual effects expensive. But that was, it forces you to think about the point of your movie, even if you don't end up doing it. It forces you to think about the point of the movie. And in Bros, it starts with Billy alone in a podcast studio talking to himself. He's a lonely guy, and it actually is a visual metaphor. So as he pitched that, I thought to myself, I don't know if I said it to him. I don't think I ever said it to him, but I was like, that is the visual metaphor for this movie.
That makes sense. And it's a good way to get his character on screen, get the audience familiar with him, get the laughs out of the way that people are going to expect right at the beginning, and let them settle. Look, this has a long history. And interestingly, Hallmark has tried on the Hallmark channel a few times to make these types of movies, and they come off being cheesy. Like, it's admirable that they're giving space to the LGBTQ plus community, but they're still kind of unfortunately missing their mark. And what I found so funny is that Luke McFarlane, who plays Aaron in the movie, has been in some of those in the past. And I'm just curious about just the casting choice of him as Aaron right from the start, because you're referencing the Hallmark movies that have tried and not entirely hit the mark, and you're calling it Hallheart in your movie. And I thought that was like a very funny meta concept.
Yeah. The Hallmark stuff was in there before Luke walked in the door. We just thought it was funny. Billy was obsessed with those movies. I then became obsessed with them after he turned me onto them. I think it's just like, it's not like they're trying to do LGBTQ. It's not a failure of like that. They're trying to do a very specific thing, which is this kind of like wish fulfillment, ultimately kind of silly escapist thing that totally has a place in romantic comedies and romance movies. It's the equivalent of like a silly action movie or something. It's like a completely valid and fun way to kind of, watch TV. And so I think like that's their goal, and I think they achieve it. I think for the kinds of movies that I make and what Billy wanted to do, we wanted to tell a really honest, raw, super funny movie that then suddenly you're crying and you don't know why. Hopefully that's the thing, And to do that, you have to, those Hallmark movies shoot in like 2 weeks, and I'm sure they write them very quickly. It's a very different thing.
Yeah.
When Luke, we did not, it kind of was accidentally meta. He walked in to audition, and it was one of those magical things. It's only happened to me a few times where this guy walked in. I was like, this guy seems to look exactly correct for this part. And then he opened his mouth and it was done. It was instant. He and Billy had instant chemistry. It was so exciting. He walked out of the room and Billy and I just looked at each other and nodded. I mean, we didn't need to say anything. I think I might have said like, that's the guy or something. Like, it was just, we were done. And he was also like the 10th guy to walk in. It was very early. We kept casting because you second guess yourself. You have to be, but the whole time we were like, it's going to be Luke. And then we just kept the Hallmark stuff in, but it was kind of accidentally meta. We're also making fun of... It was very funny. We're also making fun of the monetization of LGBTQ stuff and any kind of social issues just are funny. For a while, I tried to do a joke with that the LGBTQ awards were brought to you by Chase Bank. Our logo is going to be rainbow for the next 3 days. Like that was the motto, so it just seemed funny. Anytime you're kind of monetizing social issues, it just makes me laugh.
Yeah, I mean, and there's been great people on social media that have called out some of the large corporations that, for Pride Month, for a couple weeks, they will change their logo to have rainbows, but then they've called them out when they're giving money to anti-LGBTQ plus politicians who are writing horrible legislation. And so it's like, how could you be so two-faced? You know, one is inclusive, the other is like literally destructive. So that's a funny joke. I admire you for even going there. I guess the only other casting thing I would mention, I want to get back to the writing in a second, is I love that Harvey Firesteyn's in the movie. And I was like, oh, is he going to play himself? And then no, you had him play a character. How did you decide to have him play a character just briefly rather than a cameo as himself? And by the way, I like the choice. I'm not giving you grief over it.
It was an entirely LGBTQ cast, and it was important to both Billy and I that we have LGBTQ actors from every generation. And he was, you know, he like Billy, he's been out his whole career, which was very hard to do, you know, in the 70s and 80s. Stuff like Torch Song Trilogy and all of this, he's been on the vanguard of telling these stories in an honest way, you know, long before there were streamers and a million ways to do this, you know. Right. So, you know, we approached him and asked if he would do this part, kind of playing this guy who owns this B&B in Provincetown. And he, fortunately for us, was into it. It was I think might have been the first scene we shot was with Harvey Firestone. I was a little bit nervous. He could not be a lovelier guy, like really just the best. We asked him lots of questions about his Broadway career and all of that.
That's awesome. You know, the title, movie titles, there's a lot of thought put into them. Yeah. Rose is pretty perfect. You know, like if people don't know what the film's about, it even works. Like, oh, there's a comedy called Bros. I want to see this. And then some of the people that realize what Bros is then might be a little scared to see it, which I think is also funny in and of itself. How did you arrive on the title of Bros, and was it always called Bros?
Yeah, Billy came with the title. But what ended up happening is we had our first meeting about it, and he told me he had this kind of embryonic idea for a movie. It was very different. He even said at the time, he was like, he wasn't sure. He didn't think this was the idea, but that basically the movie comes from this Billy on the Street sketch where he is doing a tailgate for Wicked, for the play Wicked. Right. And he kind of dressed in a football jersey. He does it with Jason Sudeikis, and he does it with a bunch of frat guys. Yeah. And he kind of does this like bro-y guy. He does it later in the movie with, you know, when he's having kind of, and he does this bro-y guy. And then he said that a friend of his who's gay, who he'd had a kind of crush on for a lot of, you know, whatever, said to him after they saw the sketch, and the sketch is really, it's very funny, but it's pretty stupid. His friend said, you are hot when you dress like that, when you talk like that. You should dress and talk like that more often. And Billy was like, that is the craziest thing I've ever, that's like so crazy. So I'll be hot if I don't dress and act the way I actually am. That's like insane. And if I act like this uber masculine idiot, you know? And so I think his initial idea, which he from the very beginning was like, this is not the right idea, was someone who pretends to be this way in order to fit into some group of guys or whatever. But really what it was about is masculinity, toxic masculinity, trying to be masculine, trying to hide your emotions, trying to be, you know, not be vulnerable, all of that stuff. That's really what, you know, what the idea of the title Bros kind of encompasses.
And it's also really thematic because the movie's about identity, and Aaron as a character, he likes the community, but he's not involved with the community until he meets the character of Bobby, you know, who Billy plays. And so it's kind of like Aaron's character learning more about the community through Bobby, who is highly involved, which is also a good, you know, fish out of water look for, you know, non-LGBTQ plus audience members to get more awareness about the community from their distance. So I thought it worked on both levels, to be honest.
Oh, awesome.
It's a perfect title. Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room here for a second. You know, people talk about cultural appropriation and who could do what, who could write what, who could create what. And I've always seen it as if you're an ally and you're trying to bring light in a positive way onto characters or a community that you're not a part of, but you want to strengthen, that's a good thing. If you're just doing it for profit, like your Chase Bank joke, that's a bad thing. You're a straight fella, and you're sitting here writing what is going to be the first mainstream gay rom-com put out by a studio. And I'm just curious, what were the difficulties there in having that awareness, obviously as a writer, but also saying that these are human beings and people are people and love is love. And we're essentially doing, which you were, the structure of what most people see in hetero rom-coms. The meet cute, you know, all the different tropes are there, including, you know, the act 2, act 3, they're breaking up, something's going wrong. Like all the tropes of any rom-com that precedes this movie are here. So you could say it's different. You could say it's not different. How was your approach for that?
First and foremost, I thought of this as a comedy vehicle for Billy Eichner, who deserves one. And I've done that now a few times, like whether it be Jason Segel, Sarah Marshall, or Russell Brand with Get Him to the Greek, or Neighbors, to a certain extent with Seth Rogen and Zac Efron. And so it's building a movie for him. And as a director, I think one of my, skills is listening. I listen, I really am open and listen to everyone. And I certainly have my point of view, and I have a tone that I like to hit, and, an instinct about stuff. But I listen. And it was particularly important with this film because it's Billy's story. It's an LGBTQ story. As you know, I'm straight. And so, but I knew I needed to listen. And that's from a macro sense. I'll listen to the story. I'll listen to Billy's experiences. I'll listen when I say something and he calls bullshit on it. I'll listen to that, whatever it is, But to a micro place where, like, I'm working with the actor on the scene, and the actor, whoever it is, says, I don't know if this feels right. Maybe the scene's written incorrectly, or maybe I've blocked it wrong, or maybe, that collaboration is where truth and honesty come from, I think, ultimately. And so that's really how I approached it. I'm kind of naively optimistic when it comes to movies. I think you kind of have to be if you go into something thinking it's going to be a disaster. I mean, what's the fun in that? But so I just, I went in naively optimistic. I'm a guy. I get masculinity. Every guy has their own masculinity issues, myself included. Everything that Billy explained to me, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. That nothing was confusing, or I didn't get emotionally instantly. And I learned a lot. It's not to say I didn't learn a lot. I learned a ton. But when he would explain it, I'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, And so I don't know. That's kind of how I approached it. And then I listened to all the actors. We have a very diverse cast. At the end of the day, I start with the comedy premise. This is not. If you make a movie that's good for you and that isn't entertaining, no one's going to see it. The reason we have an LGBTQ cast, one, it's good for the movie, it's good for the world, but really, in addition to that, it forced us to dig deep and find actors who are not well known and who are super funny, and that's the secret weapon of any comedy. If you think about, like, Melissa McCarthy in Bridesmaids, and so and then a diversity of voices means you always have a different comic tone to cut to go to. Like Eve Lindley is really different than T.S. Madison, is really different than Dot Marie Jones, is really all these people are Guy Brandon. They all have different voices, and so it makes it just much funnier. And I just listen. I mean, it really is a big part of it, Yeah. I think if I came in with an agenda or with a rigid point of view, it would be problematic. But I did it, at all.
Back to the writing. You guys did, as you said, a few drafts of the script, and then you broke them back into cards, kind of reverse engineering a little so you could see where you were. When you and Billy were writing, were you just passing scenes back and forth? And how long did it take to get your first draft, I guess would be the question.
I think I wrote a draft, then Billy started writing scenes.
Okay.
Because he was finishing up a Billy on the Street thing or something.
So
he started writing
draft.
scenes. Yeah, I think so. But I don't know if any of my draft, I think there was a version of the Deborah Messing scene that might have been in that draft. I don't even know if what from my draft. And that draft was very hewed closely to the notes that we had come up with, like, and talked. So a lot of it was stuff he had said, a lot of stuff I had, whatever. But I don't even know. I actually looked for that draft recently and couldn't find it. I was like, I don't know what happened to it.
It's in your email, I promise you, because writers email everything to each other when they're on a team. So look.
I know it's somewhere in my email. And then Billy, he comes at writing too from he comes at it from a performance standpoint, which is very cool. And so he wrote scenes that were so long. Like he would send me a 15-page scene, and he would have these monologues that were so long. And I was like, I would call him and be like, this is super funny, but, like, we can't have a 15-page scene where you have three-page monologues. And he's like, no, I'm throwing every joke in, I'm throwing every idea in. I promise you that won't be what it is, but I need to, like, and so it was kind of like that. Like, he would write these very long scenes, and then I would often, like, write a version of a scene just to, and send it to him. And then he would so he would have something to work off of. And then he would maybe throw it out and start and write a completely new version of it. And then I would look at it and give him my thoughts on it or whatever. It kind of was just this weird organic thing where we traded stuff back and forth.
When you sit down to write, how long do you write for, or do you give yourself a page count each day when you sit down?
I do page count. Because I think giving yourself a time limit, it's just, you could just sit there and run out the clock. But if you have a page count, you're motivated to finish the page count because then you can go do other stuff, If I'm under the gun or I really want to get through a part of a script I don't like, I go to a coffee shop that sucks that I don't want to be in. So
you're forced to write.
I'll go to like a shitty coffee house. So that's that's another way I do it.
What's your page count that you try and hit?
It's pretty long. It tends to be like 10 pages, maybe a day. But again, not good. I'm not saying it's good. It's just to get it. And sometimes it's just to write through a section that And I'm just like, this just sucks. Like, I hate this so much. But always, once you have pages, even if they suck, when you read them the next day, it gives you ideas. And it gives you ideas that you wouldn't have if you didn't have those pages. I swear it's activating different parts of your brain when you do it. There's sitting and thinking is one part of your brain. Talking is another. Reading and writing notes on it is another. Looking at cards is another. Hearing it, a table read is another. Directing a scene activates another part. I'll think of jokes. I'll have a scene that's been sitting on my computer for 3 years, and I direct the scene, and I think of 5 jokes. It's weird. I don't know what it is.
So you and Billy were collaborating. You're sending stuff back and forth. How long would you say you had written before you finally had a draft that you could show to Apatow or the studio?
It's hard to remember. After 6 months, we had something we pitched to Judd, and then we pitched it to the studio shortly thereafter.
So it was still a pitch. You weren't handing in a script.
Yeah, no, it was a pitch. And then it was so long ago. We probably had a draft. We started talking about it in 2017, a long time ago, and then summer of 2017. And then we had a draft, I remember now, in spring or early summer of 2019.
Okay.
And then we rewrote it because my goal, I always have a very ambitious goal. I wanted to shoot it the summer of 2019, but we didn't have it ready in time. And then kind of rewrote it over that summer, got studio notes that spring or summer of 2019, and then rewrote it over the summer, and then had our first table read of fall of 2020, like November of 2020, and then went into prep. And then in March of 2020, we shut down.
I want to get out of the spoilers in a second and get into the movie. But I guess another question is, exposition's always tough. And one other admirable thing that's not really a spoiler that we could talk about, it's a subplot of the movie that they're trying to launch the LGBTQ plus museum. And you interweave a lot of history. And, it's straight exposition. Some of it is interrelated to the concept of identity, which is what's going on in the story. But you get in real history about moments in history from a gay perspective. And I'm curious about when that idea came about, because you could see it as a subplot that easily somebody could have said in a note like, let's just stick to the main story. We don't need to get in the weeds on this other stuff. But it's thematic, so it totally works.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was something early on. Billy was, we were talking about him being a podcaster because he could do his kind of comedy joke machine stuff. And then he was like, what if I was on the board of the first LGBTQ museum, which there isn't a national LGBTQ museum. There has since, in 2019, the New York Historical Society announced that they were going to build one. And so they've started building one, but it's not, right. But it's crazy that there isn't a national one. There's some very small ones around this country. And I think there might be a national one in the UK or in Germany. I can't remember. But yeah, it was an opportunity for two things. It was an opportunity to have a big comedy cast, much like the frat brothers and neighbors, or like the record executives, in Get 'Em to the Greek, to have a bunch of voices from different parts of the LGBTQ community. It was very important to both of us, particularly to Billy, that this not just be about like a gay white guy, that there be a lot of voices, because it's just like this opportunity hasn't happened before, the doors being open. And also it'll be super funny if we have more of these voices. It will feel more interesting and rich and fun, And then thematically, we both really became fascinated by this idea, which is not something, and again, this was why it was such a privilege and pleasure to get to work on this movie, because it opened my eyes to this whole thing. When you don't know your history, and when the LGBTQ history is essentially unknown, like a lot of it is, and you don't know your love stories, like if you think about entertainment, like the love stories that, Billy and I have all the same touchstones. He saw all the Nora Ephron movies. I was able to see myself in those movies as a straight guy. He had to kind of forced to see himself in them. Right. It's not his story, those movies taught me about love. The John Hughes movies taught me about love. He didn't have those stories. And so how do you love someone? How do you fall in love if you don't know your own stories, is kind of the thematic idea. In the one hand, it's very freeing. There's all these, you can throw out all the rules. You can have a throuple, you can have foursomes, you can do whatever you want. So I think that was, really interesting to him and to both of us.
It was good exposition. Well, what was important about your pre-production? It's always interesting to hear the things that are important for a director, not counting COVID. Were you storyboarding? Obviously your locations were scouting. How close were you in March of 20? And what were some of the really important things that you do for pre-production as a director in any time?
Yeah, we were real close. We were scouting, Buffalo. Originally, we were going to shoot in Buffalo. We ended up shooting in New Jersey. We had found the museum. I have a great production designer I was working with at the time, who I work with a lot, named Teresa Goulasarian, who then couldn't do the movie when it reformed. And I worked with another great production designer named Lisa Myers, who ended up, but we'd started to figure out the look of the museum. I had started to figure out where the scenes were going to take place. I had started to kind of not shotlist, but I do this thing people call photo boarding, where you're taking photos, in the sets based on where you want the characters to stand. So we were getting pretty into the nitty gritty. We had cast a lot of the movie. You know, I was scouting in March. It was going to shoot, I think, in late April. I can't remember exactly. But I remember we were scouting. I was weirdly, for scouting, I was like very scared of the pandemic starting in January. And as it was getting closer and closer to shooting, I was like, I don't see how we do this. And then we went to scout. There was a scene that took place in a hospital. We ended up cutting out the movie. But we went to scout the hospital, and I was like, I don't want to go in there. I don't think any of us should go in there. And then I was like, I don't think we can make this movie. And then we just were like in the van, scout van, being like, what are we doing here?
Well, as we know, the pandemic hit, and you ended up making this movie while there was an active pandemic. When did you finally shoot? Was the vaccination out? Was it safer? And what'd you learn about making your film during a pandemic?
I did not want to shoot until there was a vaccine. I didn't think it was appropriate or ethical. And I'll stand by that. Like, I don't think it was. I don't think that putting people in harm's way to make entertainment is a strange choice. But I wasn't going to shoot until there was a vaccine. As soon as the vaccine became available, and once it trickled down to everyone, Universal was awesome. They greenlit the movie again, despite the very bearish outlook on theatrical.
And this puts us into about the spring of 21.
Yeah, this was spring of 21, and we started to put it back together. The additional time that Billy and I had to look at the script really helped the script. You get distance from the script. You see what's wrong. Movies are a rush. It's hard to tell what works and what doesn't work. Until you've made a movie. It's people are always like, what were they thinking? It's like, you're in it so much, it's hard to tell, But yeah, that really helped, I think, that extra time. The extra time always helps with writing.
Were you able to keep your cast and crew safe? Did you use the pod system of isolating your cast and crew on location, or just daily testing? What were some of the things that you did?
Testing 3 times a week, masks on set. No, we didn't have to mask outside. It was after Delta, but before Omicron. So there wasn't, we were in a lull. It was a year ago. So it was late summer of 21. Yeah. Okay. And no cast got it. We never had to shut down.
I was surprised though. I mean, like, you had big crowd scenes. Like, that bar scene was packed. And I think
that was, we had to test. We tested all the extras. I think it was at the time I was like, we have such a, we're so good at COVID, but I think it actually was the fact that Omicron didn't exist yet, and it was during a lull. Like I think the cases kind of dipped while we were the way these things just do. We were in a dip when we were shooting. And then the cases took off kind of as we finished. I don't know if that was driven by Omicron or what, and then when there was like a lot of people in a small room that, there were limits as to how many people could be in the room. It was honestly not that different than shooting not during COVID. It was just, we had to wear masks. That was the only difference.
Testing and masking really does work. So that's great that you guys were able to pull it off.
It does work, but I'll say we shot Titanic this summer, same things, masking, testing, and we had to shut down. Like, everyone got COVID, and it was because of Omicron, so it really was, there was no difference in the approach, it wasn't like people were masked and the COVID team was excellent. It was purely that this is so much more contagious.
That's too bad that you guys had to shut down and people got it. But there's been a lot of punching through vaccinations with Omicron.
Yeah. One of our cast got it, had no symptoms. I mean, I got it, my wife got it. We took Paxlovid. I was back after 5 days. I tested negative. Okay. So it's just like, it was a different situation than I think if I had gotten it in a year ago, Well,
last question before we get into the spoilers. What was your budget and what was your schedule?
It was a little confusing because they had to absorb the budget from when we shut down, but it was around 25.
Okay.
And our schedule was 35 days, which was crazy short.
Really? And more, 35 days.
It was a rush from beginning to end. I will say I'm going to do a rare moment of patting myself on the back and saying I really pulled this one out of my butt in terms of scheduling.
There were a lot of locations for 35 days. You guys
needed to feel big. It needed to feel beautiful. It's a combination of a lot of people. It's Brandon Trost, the DP, is super fast. His key grip was really fast. The line producer, Carl Frankenfeld, came from TV. And every time I said, we need this or that, he was like, all right. He never said no and figure out creative ways around it. Billy and Luke and all the actors were really, really prepared. So a lot of times you'll have wasted time with actors who forget their lines. And by the way, actors forget their lines. I was a terrible actor. I stopped acting because I was terrified. I couldn't remember lines and I was terrified. So they might forget their lines because they're nervous and stuff, but also because sometimes they're just like, whatever, I'm doing 18 things. And they were all so prepared and on it. And it was never waiting for the actors to be ready.
Did you have a rehearsal period?
Yeah, I had a rehearsal period. Although I just rehearsed with Luke and Billy. I always mark out about 2 weeks, but it always ends up being a couple hours here and there because I don't want to make it not feel fresh on the day. I do the rehearsals in order to make sure the scenes make sense so that we can rewrite. It's a pressure-free way to rewrite the script. It's not so much about the performance as it is about, is this making sense? Well, now that we have all the actors. So as I remember, I just had Luke and Billy. I didn't, and that was due to COVID rules too, actually. We couldn't fly people in. So that actually screwed up our rehearsal time.
That makes sense. Well, look, podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify, we are going to get into the spoilers now. So if you have not yet seen Bros, it is in theaters. Go see it. Eventually, it'll be coming to digital and on demand and all that stuff through Amazon and Apple and all that. But right now, it is theatrical only. So go see Bros, press pause, and then you can also watch us on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page where I put these Zoom casts so you could see us. You could see what good old Nick looks like with a phone propped on top of Hero of a Thousand Faces. If you're wearing a PJs,
this is a great lobster place in Cape Cod.
Yep, and he's wearing a PJs t-shirt. Well, anyhow, press pause, come back because we are getting into the spoilers. Look, there is nothing new about hookup culture, but it is fascinating that you start kind of from that perspective, including Grindr, awkward hookups for this rom-com that you're kind of breaking genre norms to the point that you literally have Billy walking down the street with a Kleenex sticking to his hand because there's semen on it that he's trying to throw in a trash can with like a Sinatra song playing in the background like you would hear it in different rom-coms. And I thought it was a very interesting perspective. So how did you decide to start from the perspective of hookup culture, which, by the way, rom-coms have done time and again, of the people that are kind of looking for something more solid in their life rather than the revolving doors that they're used to?
In order to establish this character, it seemed really important. The character is someone whose life is his career. He has a very rich life. He has a very exciting career. He has a lot of friends, ton of friends, but he's a lonely guy. And so we wanted to really show that he has this podcast thing that's really successful. We show him with celebrities and stuff. We wanted to show him then on a stage and show how important he is in the world. And then we wanted to cut hard to him alone and him on this Grindr date. And that was always the beginning of the movie. I initially was like, because I love big set pieces, I was like, is this Grindr sequence big enough? Do we need a bigger set piece? And Billy was very insistent that we just show exactly what happens on a Grindr hookup, or at least in this Grindr hookup. Obviously, there's
it was very awkward.
Very awkward, and it totally comedically works. Like there's something the audience cannot believe. If you're gay or if you're straight, you cannot believe you're seeing this. That it's just like, and it's being treated not like some tragedy or something that should be taken seriously, but something what it is, which is like this kind of awkward, hysterical encounter. It's just inherently funny when two strangers meet to have sex and then one of them just leaves. It's just funny. It's just like a funny concept, We didn't really turn it into a bigger meal than that, and it always kind of set the tone of the movie and also gets a big laugh.
You have a lot of weight on your shoulders, and it was so funny to also see you just take it off in the beginning and decide that you're going to go wherever you want to go. It's one thing to try and say, I'm going to do a rom-com that is a mainstream gay rom-com. That in itself is a tough assignment. But you actually also threw another concept that is not in normative mainstream movies, which is the concept of polyamory, which exists in every community. But open relationships, you were throwing that in here. And it was very wild to me that on the first date for Aaron and Bobby, that he invites him up and he's like, nah, I don't want to go up. And he's like, but do you want to go have sex with that other couple that I'm hooking up with? And I'm telling you, like, because I maybe this is just me and I'm just an idiot, but like I detected a music change. I detected almost a lighting change. And when they're suddenly in this foursome with another couple, I actually thought you were doing a dream sequence or a parody. Like, because I thought like, oh no, they're not going to go down that path. Like, so I thought like the joke was at the end of the date, rather than the two of them hooking up, it's just like this idea of going for a foursome. No. It's not a dream sequence. You went for it. That is the end of their first date. And that's like a whole other concept to try and tackle for any rom-com, like the concept of an open relationship. So at what point did you realize that was going to be a part of the movie? Because truly rom-coms are often built on, not all of them, but sometimes the concept of a love triangle. And so the concept of it being a norm to have an open relationship here and there threw in Josh as a threat, not a threat later in the movie when Aaron wants to satisfy the curiosity with his former hockey teammate, Josh, who has come out, midway through the movie and causes jealousy issues. So tell us about kind of diving in that way, because it's not just a joke in the beginning. It becomes something that they're coming back to of, are they going to be exclusive in a world that they're in, which has open relationships? And they're also, for straight people too, open relationships. It's not just that community.
From the get-go, it was really important for Billy and I, and I knew this is why I wanted to work on this, that it not be a rom-com where it's a straight couple and then we replace the woman with a guy. Like that would just, not. And so there's all these different rules and there's all these different things that happen in the gay community, one of which is very prevalent, which is open relationships. It's just like a thing. If you have a lot of men, if it's men dating men, as Billy says, if it's men dating men, and guys were horny and want stuff to be open. And so that was really important. It kind of ebbed and flowed over the course of the writing process. There were versions of the script where like it kind of took over the movie a little bit too much, where it was like the whole thing was about, do they have an open relationship? And at the end, maybe Bobby's character is into the idea of having an open relationship. And then it started to feel like this, it started to feel like the high concept of the movie was about an open relationship, not about masculinity. It kind of took over in a way that kind of distracted from what we were talking about in the film, which is these two guys not being able to be vulnerable with each other. So so it was always part of it. From the beginning. I think initially their first date just ended like with a lot of scripts. When you're writing it, you find the comedy as you're writing it. Once you've written the kind of honest version of the scene, I think it just ended with them having a kiss and then Luke not wanting to go upstairs. And then Billy thought of that idea of like, what if they get a blowjob? And it was like the funniest. I was like, that's the funniest thing I've ever heard. It's so funny. And then we cast those guys, were so funny. They're a real couple, the baseball players. And that guy was like, oh, it's nice to meet you. So like, it really made me laugh. But I think that was a big, important part of it. And then it's interesting in the second half of the movie with Josh Evans, his like hockey crush. You're always looking to lift stuff out of the movie. I tried to lift as an experiment. I lifted the whole foursome that's in the second half of the movie and him wanting to be with Josh and just made it that they break up and then he catches him making out with Josh Evans. And I lifted the foursome and Billy saying, I don't know if I like this. And it suddenly felt like a straight romantic comedy. It did not feel honest. It just was like, really? I didn't believe it. I was like, I'm sorry. He wouldn't be that mad if he ran into Aaron making out with Josh Evans. He would be like, he might be annoyed, but he wouldn't be like destroyed. But like having to lay out something that's so antithetical to Bobby's whole thing, which is everyone should be able to live the way they live. Everyone should be able to do whatever they want. Having for him to be vulnerable and say like, I didn't like it when I saw you making out with that guy. I did not like that. And it's kind of embarrassing, but it's true. And then to have him make out with that guy is like the worst possible thing that Aaron could do. You needed that. You needed all of that to happen, I think. It's
interesting because again, in open relationships, if you're going through it with your partner and your partner's consent and all that, that's what would bolster it. So again, to your credit, one of the biggest laughs in the movie I thought was when Aaron wants to consummate with Josh. They're at a party and they invite Bobby into the group as well. And then suddenly a random character we haven't met just shows up, a really awkward guy. And he's like, hi, it's Steve. And like Steve throws himself into the middle of it. So at this point, maybe Bobby's thinking, okay, this could work. But now he's like off to the side, stuck with awkward Steve through the whole, group experience. And that was absolutely a great laugh as well for that first scene that you're talking about that you almost cut. So I absolutely love that. Obviously, there's no exact antagonist. Josh is a threat. They get over it, as you said, because their relationship could survive that and they decide that they want each other. It seems like the other thing that was going on was the falling apart possibility of the museum and how they needed to fundraise for it. So it was interesting to see that as like your B story, and you continuing to satisfy that because each time you're there, it's different parsecs of identity. So I like that.
I mean, it's very like, it's a proper B plot where like as Bobby's life falls apart, the museum almost falls apart. And then he needs to kind of, as they say in all the screenwriting books, dig deep and figure out that he needs to, forgive people and maybe he doesn't know everything. And so he kind of apologizes to the board.
Ooh, hey kids, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you that Backstory just turned 10. That's right. We've made it a decade. We're here. We've survived and we couldn't have done it without your help. And, we want to keep doing it. So your support means everything to us. And now is a perfect time to subscribe because we just released our big summer issue. That's right. We have Emmy contenders ranging from Stranger Things, Barry, Better Call Saul, What We Do in the Shadows, Station 11, and Hacks. We also have summer movies. We have an interview with actor Glenn Powell, who plays Hangman in Top Gun Maverick. We have John Carpenter, the director of The Thing, on its 40th anniversary. Looking back, there are so many great articles to read in Backstories. Huge summer issue. There's also scripts to read. I know you'll dig it. If you've never read us before, you could, of course, test drive us by reading the free issue, which you could find at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And look, after you check us out and test drive us, I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. And just to sweeten the deal, I want to offer you discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. All you got to do is enter that code at backstory.net, and it'll get you access to both the iPad login and over at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop as well. Look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of all these Zoomcasts. That's right. You could watch us do these interviews because they were Zooms that I've put on YouTube on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page. It would really mean a lot to me to have you support my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now let's jump right back into our interview with co-writer and director Nicholas Stoller about his latest film, Bros, which is in theaters. So I hope you mask up and go check it out. I was surprised. I mean, like, again, not shocked in any way, shape, or form, but like the light that you were shining, you also at one point in the movie used poppers, which is a drug that's prevalent in the community. And it's like right on the borderline of how much explaining should you do to be responsible, that poppers could actually be dangerous. They could cause brain damage if used improperly. And at the same time, we're just, using it in a certain scene. Was there any debate on whether or not to use it? And by the way, I'm not saying that there has to be a debate anytime drugs are used in a movie, but again, mainstream rom-com, you were definitely not shy to put everything in there, and I commend you on that.
Yeah, well, we never shot an explanation. My instinct was like, we should just do it. This is just something that's used a lot. As drugs go, it's pretty mild. I mean, the number of drug stuff I've shot that's so much worse than poppers, like the Jeffrey and Get Him to the Greek, which has every drug known to man in it. It was more just like, this is part of it. This is part of sex. This is part of this sort of thing sometimes. And so we were just like, we should do it. We should include it, and then we'll see how it plays with and without it. And then we were like, you know what? It plays really nice with it. This is what happens in this scene, and it felt real and it felt honest. And I never really thought about it really. And I think if you're gay, it feels like, oh yeah, I've experienced that, or have friends. This feels honest. And if you're straight, it's like, oh, that's interesting. I've never seen that before. That's oh, okay. That's an insight into how this happens, or how some people have sex or whatever. And so that's kind of the way we approached it.
For a movie about identity, I mean, you were talking about it earlier, but let's get into it for sure now. The monologue that Billy delivers in the middle of the movie is just a true showstopper, where he's talking about himself and he's talking about the concept of the world always trying to silence him and saying it's never the right time to be out and open. Let's just try and, follow the path as close as we can, and they won't bug us. And I thought it was just a fantastic monologue. And I want to talk about the evolution of how you saw it as the co-writer, cheering on your writer, because I'm sure a lot of it was probably also autobiographical for Billy, and people, will debate how much of this movie is autobiographical versus fiction. So kind of talk us through that, because that is a tough thing to balance in a movie like this.
Yeah, so that came from, we were having a debate in my office, as we often did. I kept saying, like, what is this character's problem? I didn't understand the character's problem. I was like, and he was like, he's really busy, and I was like, why didn't you date for a long time? I said it to Billy, because he was, single. I was like, why didn't you date for a while before? This movie's very loosely based on a relationship he had that was kind of very brief, very, very, very loosely. And I kept asking him, and he was like, I was just really busy. And I was really focused on my career. I was just really busy. And he kept saying that. And then finally I said to him, I was like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I need to know the problem, because just being too busy is not a character issue. That's just that's not interesting. What's the guy's problem? What is his problem? And he kind of just suddenly opened up in my office and told me a version of that monologue. He's completely self-made. I had mentor. Judd was my mentor. But his mentor was YouTube essentially, and Funny or Die. He just started posting videos. He's always been out. He's been told by the industry, directly, you're too gay to be a movie star. He's just always been upfront about who he is. His comedy is based on being gay. It's very like, and it's hysterical. And that's why he's so honest about who he is. That's why he's so funny. And he's been told by the industry, no, this doesn't work. No, 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 no. And so that was the monologue is a version of what he has heard throughout his career. And in order to succeed, he had to just put everything else aside and just focus on his career. And in addition to that, like the character, his mom died when he was in his 20s and his dad died. I think his dad died and then he flew out to LA to try to make it on Funny or Die. And he was like, I don't know what I'll do if I don't make it. And he told me this story. It was very moving. And like the cold-hearted jerk I am, he finished his thing. He was like literally tearing up. And I said to him, okay, that's what you need to say in the movie. Like I instantly was like, that whole, what you just said goes in the movie. And so he wrote a version of it that's different, obviously, but the core of it is the emotional core has some similarities.
I mean, it is, and I'm not being hypercritical here because I don't know if you did it for comedic effect, but he bears his soul, a great monologue. And then Aaron says, you want another beer? like Aaron's just like a little unsure how to react in that moment. Yeah. I laughed out loud when that happened, but
the audience laughed. When we shot it, I didn't know that was. I think anytime you have a very dramatic scene, just any tension release at all gets a laugh, particularly when you're doing a comedy. And so I was like, do we need a bigger comedic moment here? Do we need something? And then this is the scene that I was talking about. And then ultimately it came down to like, I don't think we do. I think we let this speak for itself. And then the audience finds the comedy relief with Do You Want Another Beer? And my initial cut of that scene was a lot shorter. And Billy was like, no, we got to live in this. He was right. Because I was worried the audience would drift or it wouldn't feel appropriate for the film, given
That's really interesting that you were worried about that. Cause I mean, it's so character focused and you're great at character focused comedy, but I mean, like, Billy's your lead. So, I mean, I get it. Like that happens to a lot of people in the editing room in which they have inhabited their screenplay for so long. They've shot it. They've seen the scenes a million times. They get those self-doubts. So, I mean, I guess it's good to have a partner like Billy to say like, no, let's stay.
Yeah. I mean, it's not self-doubt so much as like, you're always trying to distill it to the shortest, most poignant version of the thing. So it wasn't that I cut it out. It was necessary. It was the whole movie was that long. Right. I was worried a very long version of it. The audience might be like, and it's a monologue. It's not a long scene. It's a monologue. I didn't know if the audience would go there, and his instinct was they would. And then it routinely was the top 5 favorite scenes. And usually the top 5 favorite scene is like the wedding shop scene in Bridesmaids. It's like a big tear down the house kind of. And this is not that. But people were you could hear a pin drop during that scene. It's an amazing. And so he was right. And that's, again, something I took from it. I was like, oh, if you can live with the character even in something that needs to destroy every 10 seconds. Like you can just stop and not try to tell a joke for a minute.
What were some of your biggest left turns? What were some of the things that for a while were in early drafts of the screenplay? It's just fun to hear about that never were shot, like never made it into the movie, but you either couldn't afford it or you just decided, it's too much of a side path. What were some versions of Bros that legitimately still could have been funny and fun that just never even were shot?
I don't remember anything we couldn't afford. We figured out tricky ways around everything, even stuff we couldn't afford.
Sure.
I can't remember anything we didn't shoot that was really funny or interesting that got jettisoned. There was stuff we shot that was really funny and good that we ended up cutting out for good reasons. But in terms of stuff we didn't shoot, there were versions of it where he went home with Luke to Luke's like little town, and it was more of like that kind of, was like a coming home kind of third act,
right?
That we tried that just didn't work. That was kind of an interesting, experiment.
What was the geekiest argument you guys had? Even good collaborators will get hung up and have no, I'm going to show you this clip. You're wrong. Or, somebody's grabbing a book off the wall or whatever.
Oh, yeah. We fought a lot, and debated, but that's healthy. That's like a healthy partnership is debating shit. We just debated all the time. He would yell at me, I would yell at him. Then he would be like, I love you too. It's like that kind of thing. I think, again, both tall Jews. So we're going to get yell. In terms of the debates, I mean, on the other side, I mean, I had a long debate with him, and he, again, we both ended up agreeing. I think it's why we're good partners. We kind of we both have strong opinions and are terrified of the thing sucking, but are ultimately like collaborative with each other. In the city bike scene, I said to him, we need, he wanted to be this kind of what it is, which is a street scene between Luke and him. And I said, we need someone to come through with a city bike. We just have to. We need it. It will break the tension, and it also is what would happen. And he really just didn't want to. And I finally said to him, we will shoot it both ways, but we just have to do it. And finally he relented. I was like, there's certain times where I'll like, if the actor has a strong opinion, I'll finally just relent just out of laziness or whatever. But this was, I felt very strongly about it. And it's a huge laugh. And it kind of,
yeah, I mean, it's a funny laugh because they're having like an emotional argument and somebody's trying to park their bike and he just,
it literally happened. I mean, I thought of it, but it before this had happened, but it happened. We were rehearsing near some city bike scenes and it happened during the rehearsal, which was so funny. We ultimately would agree, I think, for the most part. You know, it wasn't like, there's nothing in the movie that either, and I imagine you'd say the same thing. There's nothing in the movie that I didn't want in the movie and vice versa, you know?
There is always that moment in a rom-com where something goes wrong. So they're falling out of love. There's something injected, and it's that kind of end of Act 2, Act 3 kind of turn of how are we going to resolve this, right? That becomes your central question. And so you're having that breakup, and again, it's coming back to identity. In which, you know, you said, it's interesting to hear that you said that at one point they were going to Aaron's hometown and that's where the trouble was. In your movie, you just condensed it very compactly in a nice way in which they're going to dinner, you know, with Aaron's family who's visiting town.
You know, there was something we didn't shoot because it was too hard to figure out.
Tell me.
Was an ice skating scene. We were going to have an ice skating scene where Billy doesn't know
of rom-coms.
Which is in a lot of rom-coms, and where Billy doesn't know how to ice skate. He's very scared, and he's never ice skated before, and he's kind of being very kind of not courageous and embarrassing Luke in front of his family, who are all really good ice skaters. And so that was a scene and we ended up losing. You know, there was an ice skating scene in Happiest Season that was not that idea, but it was a comic scene on it. And we were suddenly like, let's not do this. And then it also was very hard to figure out. We were shooting in the summer and spring. The whole thing was, it was like a house of cards in terms of how we could do it. So we decided just to bail on it.
Editing is the last stage of storytelling. What did you learn about your film in the editing room? Tell us about some of those scenes you were alluding to that were cut out.
So we cut out a bunch of stuff that was really funny. We cut out, mainly because it was too broad, like the tone of your movie kind of slowly reveals itself in my experience. And you can't, I would argue, I'm sure other people would say it's not true, but the tone of my movies are essentially, it's grounded and then crazy shit happens, but nothing I think in many of my movies couldn't happen, you know? But this was very, very grounded. And we had a whole sequence at the Pride Parade where there's a giant pride fight. And all the different groups of people start fighting with each other. Someone just yells out, "Pride fight!" And they get into this big fight. It's instigated by a group of guys who they call themselves the gay Twitter witches. And they're super funny, and they're tweeting nasty stuff about Billy, and then Luke defends him, and they get into this big fight. And it just was hilarious. It always got big laughs in the audience, but it didn't really serve the story, and it was also broad, so we lost it. We also had this really funny scene with this actor named Malik Pancholi, who's really funny, where Billy decides he's going to go on Tinder dates, and then he comes home, and he goes home with this guy Malik, and he's really into this thing called nipple plumpers, which are these things that you get stuck on your nipples, and you play with your nipples. And it was one of the funniest scenes I've ever shot, but it just didn't fit in the story. Billy and Malik are so funny in it, but it didn't. It'll be wherever deleted scenes go, you should check it out. It's really, there was also a whole sequence of just like them working out, like just like gay men working out, and like a whole sequence of the workout culture, which was really funny. We didn't ever figure out a way to explain it clearly, like to explain the comic premise. And again, the more I edit, the more I write, the more I work on stuff. If it's not attached to story, you're going to cut it. And so it also wasn't really story driven.
Because when they're broken up, you know, he meets somebody at the gym and he's using roids and he has the big roids argument with the other people at the museum. So you brushed on it for sure. Tell us about finding that. Tell us about finding that ending. You know, it's the big event. It's the song. What were some of the other endings you played with before you arrived there?
You know, we had a bunch of different endings. I had a version where I thought it'd be funny if they both ran to each other just because they're both men. And it was just like, but it wasn't really emotional driven. It was more just like this funny theoretical movie idea. And it took a while to land at that. What happened is we were shooting the movie and Billy had this idea about 3 weeks before the end, like kind of inspired by something Luke had said to him, where Luke said his favorite singer was Garth Brooks. And Billy was like, "That's so funny." And was like, and then suddenly he called me and he was like, "I have a song. I think I should sing a song at the end." And Judd and I had been kind of asking Billy for the whole development process for him to make some sort of big romantic gesture towards Luke. And the way the movie was structured is Luke really needed to make the gesture towards Billy because Luke is the one who does a little bit more wrong stuff to him. But then when we put it up on its feet and stuff, and when we were looking at it, it made sense that both would need to make gestures, you know? And so Luke does reach out, he does all this stuff, and Billy, who doesn't trust anyone, keeps knocking it down. And then he makes this big gesture at the end, which is like him kind of opening himself completely up to this guy. And so he wrote this song. Mark Shaman, who's the composer, who did all the legendary composer, he came over to New Jersey and we performed it live. Billy sang it live. I've done a lot of music stuff. It's always generally pre-recorded, particularly the music, but we did it all live and we did it and it was beautiful. And that was it. That was the ending.
That's great. What was your toughest scene? What was your toughest scene on the page writing, and how did you crack it? The scene you kept sweating coming back to over and over. And what was your toughest scene to shoot?
Toughest scene on the page was probably the end. Is always the hardest because you're trying to figure out the exact right structure for the end. So that just kept changing all the time. The scene where Luke opens up to Billy in bed and about being a chocolatier was hard because it's written for Billy. It's not written for Luke. Luke is also playing more of a character, I think, than Billy is. I mean, Billy is acting in the movie. He's a very good actor, but Luke, he went to Juilliard. He's very in touch with his feelings. He's very he's an artist. He's not a lawyer who has no feelings. So so we had to kind of create that a little bit. So that took a few passes. The opening took a while. That was a lot of editing. That was a lot of figuring out exactly how much comedy to have at the beginning, how much, for a while I was like, we should just start with the grinder date. I think that's a really kind of cool way to start. But Billy thought we should start with the comedy to set the tone, which I was like, that makes sense too. So we tried lots of different stuff.
Okay. And then what was your toughest scene to shoot?
The walk and talks. I don't love shooting walk and talks. They're hard. And the walk and talk in New York was hard because we didn't have much time. We were losing the light. They're walking, they're talking a lot. Billy has a lot to say. Luke has a lot to react to, and he also has a lot to say. It's really important. It's their first, meeting. It's important to have a
one camera or two.
That was one camera. You can't. It's hard to do two cameras with the walk and talk. That's hard. I don't like shooting walk and talks. We needed to do one. It's a New York movie. You want that scene of the couple walking. But you can't do it the way, Woody Allen did, where it's just one shot, because you need to be able to edit it. You need to make it funnier. No offense to Woody Allen, but some of those scenes are often more dramatic or interesting than they are funny. We needed to be able to cut stuff out. And so we needed different coverage on it. So it's a little bit, I think if you're just doing the simple walk and talk without worrying about any of that, it's a little easier. But the way that to make this kind of movie, you have to have coverage. So yeah, probably the walk and talk.
Well, look, mission accomplished. I absolutely love the movie.
Thank you.
I'm sure it will find its audience. What's next? What do you want to tell us about that you're working on next?
So there's a show, Platonic, that I'm working on with my wife that we wrapped. We're editing right now. It stars Seth Rogen and Rose Byrne. So that's going well. And then there's a movie that I'm working on that's in development right now for Will Ferrell and Reese Witherspoon. That's for Amazon, that I'm very excited to be working on. That's a big kind of wedding movie, but it is not a romantic comedy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, you have been so generous with your time, and thank you so much for hanging out and chatting. It's always good to see you. Nick, congrats.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to co-writer and director Nicholas Stoller for being so generous with his time in coming down to chat today about his latest film, Bros. Remember, it's in theaters, so I hope you mask up and go see it to show studios that you want to see more films like this. Or, of course, you could catch it on digital in 3 or 4 weeks as well. Of course, while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine. We just turned 10, folks. We lasted a decade, and we couldn't have done it without your support. And we just published our huge summer issue. It has Emmy contenders ranging from Stranger Things, Barry, Better Call Saul, Hacks, What We Do in the Shadows, and Station 11. We have actor Glenn Powell, who plays Hangman in Top Gun Maverick, talking about what it was like to be in that incredible film and his process. And, he's also a screenwriter. There's scripts to read in Backstory. There's also an interview with director John Carpenter on the 40th anniversary of The Thing. There's so many great pieces in our summer issue, and we're continuing to add to it. So it would be fantastic to have you as a subscriber. And of course, to sweeten the deal, if you want to subscribe now, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory. You just enter that code into the shopping cart at backstory.net, and it will give you access to both the iPad app and the website. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where all these Zoomcasts go. That's right. These are Zoom interviews. So you could watch us have these discussions on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page. It would really mean a lot to me to have you consider supporting my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2022. All rights reserved. Folks, if you want to find me on social media, you could always find me as Yo Goldsmith on Twitter or Backstory_mag on Twitter. You could also find those same accounts on Instagram. So Yo Goldsmith on Instagram or Backstory_mag on Instagram. You could check out our Facebook fan page, or you could even send us an email at backstoryletters@gmail.com. That inbox gets a little cluttered sometimes, so I apologize if I don't respond immediately, but I love hearing what folks have to say, and I promise you I will do my darndest to get to your message. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.